Hello, everyone. It's Charlene Lee, and today I'm going to be talking about how to lead through a permacrisis. So, this is an interesting topic I've been working on for the past couple of months, and it's something that came up at the end of 2022 when the Collins Dictionary actually said that the word of the year for 2022 was the word permacrisis. And it really got me to it really captured my attention because I felt it really captured the moment for what we're going through. And they define a permacrisis as a sense of being in a never-ending crisis. It's just one thing layered on top of another. And it felt like, okay, we just got through COVID and then the supply chain crisis and then capital markets going up and down, a war in Europe, energy crisis. Now we have tons of disinformation happening. And then we have this artificial intelligence challenge that's taking us by storm. So it feels like as a leader, we're never going to get a break. It's just one thing on top of another. And we used to be able to say, we'll just get through this crisis and then we'll deal with these other things. And now there's no such thing as getting through it. We're just living with it all the time. And so one of the problems is that our traditional ways of dealing with a crisis no longer work. We used to be able to get in hands on as a leader. We would quicken the pace, we would cut things, we would ask people for the time being, take on a higher workload. And the reality is, when you're in a perma crisis, people burn out. You burn out. So, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with the fact that now, more than ever, there's no such thing as we'll go through a change, we'll go through disruption, and then we'll go back to being normal? We talked about in COVID, this is the new normal. Well, I think the new normal is that we're going to be constantly on edge, constantly trying to figure out what is going on, dealing with uncertainty and change. So I think this requires that we rethink what it means to be a leader. I have always defined leadership as a relationship between people who aspire to create change and those who are inspired to follow them. And leadership is needed more than ever now because we're going through a constant state of change. What's new is that these changes are constantly coming at us. We may be trying to create them ourselves and transform ourselves, but it feels like there are a lot of external forces happening now, and they're just compounding on top of each other. So we can't afford to just be managers anymore of the status quo because the status quo just won't cut it. So how do we lead in the perma crisis? And that's what I want to talk about today. So I would love for you to share where you're coming from and then also share what crisis is the most of concern to you these days. I'm curious to know what's keeping you up at night. What are you thinking about? What's the major crisis that you're dealing with? And there are so many to pick from. So pick from one of them, share them, and maybe hear from others too, like, oh, yeah, I'm feeling that too as well. So Sanjeev, so good to have you join us from India. Again, others, please join and share where you're coming from, but also share what are you struggling with? What are you working with? What are you excited about these challenges and tackling them? So we'll talk a little about what that is. So what I want to talk about today is that we used to say that what doesn't kill us will make us stronger. And the reality is these crises are no longer just making us stronger, they're just wearing us down. They're making us feel much more vulnerable, much more shaky. So we need transformational leaders, leaders who lead in a different way day in, day out, regardless of what crisis is happening. Because when we are transformational leaders, these disruptive transformational leaders, disruption is part of our vocabulary. It's how we operate. And so we are very well suited for dealing with the perma crisis because if we're not creating a transformation ourselves, we're leading a transformation because of these external forces that are coming to us. So we need transformational leaders now more than ever in order to deal with all this change and uncertainty. And in particular, we need leaders to step in to provide that structure, that stability, when all of the institutions and the infrastructure and the platforms around us are faltering, they're failing around us. So I think these transformational leaders, and I believe that if you're listening to this live stream, you believe that you're one of them too, as well. That you really believe in this potential for this greatness, for this potential for us to do amazing things for ourselves, but also for the people around us in our organizations, in our communities, in our families. So let's dive into how do you actually make this happen. So just want to say hello to Cynthia, who's coming in from Jacksonville, Florida, and hello, Mark. Good to see you here again. And Mark is sharing this one particular crisis balance. Really like that. What deserves most of our attention, and how do I evaluate that? So we're going to talk about that in just a second, Mark. So great question to be asking. So today I'm going to be talking about three things: leading yourself, how that looks different, leading your teams, and then leading your organization. So let's get into this. And just a shout out to Jafana coming also from Florida. There's I think a growing number of people coming in from Florida. So thank you for joining. All right. So leading yourself. One of the hardest parts about a crisis is taking a look and saying, what's coming up for you as a leader? You're facing this situation, as Mark was sharing. I've got all these different things. How do I figure out what's the most important thing I have to pay attention to? And so one of the issues here is having that self-awareness, that mindfulness. And this is why I'm such a big believer in practicing mindfulness. And this is not about meditating for hours at a time, but being mindful of how you are feeling about these crises. What are the emotions that are coming up for you? How are you thinking about this? Are you uh, s- uh, uh, shrinking in and having fear and anxiety come up, and thinking about things from a scarcity point of view, versus what are the possibilities that this opens up? How are you going to stay calm and deal with your emotions so that you can actually see the reality of what's happening around you? So, to Mark's point, one of the biggest issues is, how do I figure out and pay attention? How do I evaluate what's really going on here? One of the most important things to do first is check in with yourself and say, are you in a good place to begin doing this? Because if you're not, then you need to get right with that first and foremost. So, one of the hardest things with this is dealing with the potential for failure. And that's always looming, because here's a crisis, it's coming at you. Well, what happens if I don't succeed? And we're dealing with that, with the shame and the fear and anxiety of that, with the reality of the situation. And sometimes that gets in the way. And I'll give an example. When I was running my company, I was really focused on growing the company, also writing a book and doing a lot of things. And I took my eye off of the financials. I assumed that they were going fine, and I didn't realize the sales were a little bit slower coming in. Our cash flow was starting to suffer, and then all of a sudden I realized, oh, we're going to run out of cash. And so cash is king. And so realize that this is not going to be a short-term fix that I could do with just a couple of loans and some bridging. We were going to have to lay off people. And I was so consumed by that shame that I closed in on myself. And what I should have been doing was to reach out to my network to talk through, how do I do this? How do I think about creating that stability and structure for my team going forward, as well as do the best thing possible for the people we were letting go? And instead, I was so consumed by that shame. It was really frozen in place and not able to be at my best self. So, really important in this area is leading yourself and be dealing with those areas of the emotions that come up. Because if you can't deal with those, if you can't lead yourself through this crisis, then you're not going to be able to lead anyone else. So, a very important action point to have here is to make sure you have that support network. Now, I had a support network, but I still felt really shameful. It was a group of other really capable CEOs. I'm like, how am I going to show up and be embarrassed to talk about this? And instead, I should have trusted that network, trusted my peers, trusted in that relationship to know that it was going to carry me through this moment of crisis. So make sure you have a support network that can help you see through your emotions, to see through to the truth, who will not shy away from giving you the hard news, the hard medicine that you need to take, that will help you. And these are your peers. It could be your coach. It could be somebody who's checking in constantly with you. And you have that basis of trust in that relationship to be able to give you that support. The other thing to do is to be really, really strong in your communications at this point. One of the easiest things to do is, because if you don't have the answers, you don't want to communicate out, and you have to stay in communication with people. Even if it's just to say, I don't know what we're doing. I don't know what the response is going to be. I'm working on it. Even just communicating that back to people is a really important thing to do because at least people know you're there, you're thinking about it. You may not know all the answers at that point, but you're still present. Because what people really want, what employees really want is that you be honest, you be fair in your decisions, and that you really be empathetic, that you are expressing the concern that you feel and see and understand where they are, as well as the situation overall. So the communication is so key because we tend to shut down and not communicate when at the exact that moment we need to be communicating out. So, a couple things here. Let's see, just a couple comments before I move on to the next area. We have here from Jay, permacrisis disruption had been appropriate by demagogues and dictates to justify extra legal behaviors. Business leaders can often succumb to crises to justify actions. That's so true, Jay. But I think also at the same time, what we're dealing with here are real concerns and actions from people. I'm sure there are leaders who manufacture crises to be able to assert themselves or to do political plays. But I think more than anything else right now, what we really want to have is to make sure that we are being true to what's going on because you can only do that so many times inside of an organization before people start distrusting you. And I'll talk a little bit about how that relationship trust is changing over time. Cynthia, thank you so much for joining. Shakil, also coming from Pakistan. So thank you for joining us. So Sanjeev has a question, how to overcome the situation to select between empathy and sympathy. Sanjeev, you raise a really good point. And I'm going to talk about this in the next section is how do you make sure that you're having empathy for your team members, but you're not coddling them, not having this go to the point where it's sympathy in a way that's detracting you from actually dealing with the crisis. I often hear from leaders that I'm working with, well, if I take the time to focus on the relationship, we're not focusing on the tasks. Or if I focus on the relationship, I'm being soft with them when I need them to be really hard and on point. And the reality is, if you do not focus on the relationship and build that up, you're not going to have the trust. People are not going to be pulling hard for you at the exact moment when you need them to be pulling hard for you. So I think it's really hard when you're making these decisions, Sanjay. You just added here also, how do you decide when you're making decisions? Let me go into that in the next section, which is we just talked about leading yourself. Now I want to talk about leading your team. And one of the things that you see happening in a crisis, especially if there's an economic crisis facing the company, is that you're canceling offsites because we can't afford to take a day off or 2 days off to go someplace offsite, have a really nice offsite, be social, have connections with each other. We need to focus on the work. We can't afford to do that. And from the money point of view or from a time point of view. And this is the worst thing you can do. I believe that if you focus more on tasks than relationships, to prioritize doing things rather than developing people, you're going to pay for this in the long term. And especially if you understand we're in a perma crisis, you'll be adjusting things. So if it's a short-term crisis, sure, we're going to have to focus something for the next month. We may want to cancel or postpone something. But when you're in a perma crisis, when are you going to postpone it to? When will there be a better time? So you're better off having that offsite, investing in it, doubling down on the content, on developing the relationships, but maybe cutting down on the costs. One person said, you want to have 5-star content in a 3-star setting. So you may just have it in the office instead of an offsite at a hotel. You may have it so that you're using inside facilitators, but you're really giving them the time to develop the content in a way that's thoughtful and meaningful to move the relationship forward. The reason I focus on the relationship is because that's all leadership is. Again, it's a relationship between you as a leader and your followers to create the change that you want to see. And really, you have to define what that relationship looks like. What kind of relationship do you want? And when I ask leaders this, they look at me with really puzzled faces and say, what do you mean? What kind of relationship do I want? Never really thought about that. Well, how would you describe, how would you put into words the feelings that are in that relationship? Would you describe it as trusted, dependable, loyal? How would you describe what that relationship looks like and feels like? And how would your employees and team members describe that? How is work going to change? How is the relationship going to change as we go through this tough period? What parts of this relationship are we never going to compromise on? That we're going to stay in communication, that I will always tell you exactly what's happening so that we can work through things. I'm not going to give you false deadlines just so we can have fake deadlines because we know we're not going to make that. I mean, these kinds of games that people play don't help build healthy, strong relationships. So we saw during COVID that employee engagement went up very, very quickly because simply leaders were saying and taking the time to ask people, how are you doing? When George Floyd and his murder happened, even more so, people were leaning in saying, how are you doing? What's really going on? Let's check in. And so when we have high employee engagement, when we are constantly checking in, that fosters that relationship, feeds the relationship so that we can then go strongly into these crises and get things done. It's extremely counterintuitive because it feels like we should be focusing more on doing things, not focusing more on talking with each other. But unless that relationship is really strong, those cultures and those norms and the values of how we're going to work together are really clear, you can't go fast. So, one of the hardest things we do in a crisis is that as leaders, we tend to dig down deeper into things. We tend to get into the mess. We want to know what's going on. So, we feel like we have to be more hands on. We have to be more in control of the situation because we feel so out of control. And it's fine to go in with a quick dive to just understand what's going on, but you better get out of it as quickly as possible and let your team members continue with their work, letting them know you're there to support them, but not here to take over. Because if you do, you're sending the signal that you don't trust them. And at these moments of crises, and especially in a perma crisis, you have to be able to let go of that need to be in control. Because frankly, you were never in control in the first place. So again, very counterintuitive to what we normally would do in a crisis, but in a perma crisis, we have to be able to let go. We have to be able to create agency in our team members. And instead of having all the answers, because oftentimes we're promoted, became a leader because we had the answers, we know what's going on. We have to now instead be comfortable asking questions because in a perma crisis, with so many things piling on top of each other, there's no way that we as leaders can know all the answers. So, this is about leadership in your team and developing a very different relationship where you're increasing the agency of your team members, you're stepping out of the way, and you're providing more of that longer term vision, the definition and redefinition of success and alignment with them, and making sure that they're developing. And so the last point I want to make is, are you developing your top people? And even in a crisis, when things look really dark, you may be focused on, well, how do we lay off people, maybe cutting costs, all these issues. I know it's becoming an issue with artificial intelligence. A lot of questions right now and concerns. Are we going to be having to cut costs because you don't need people as much because of artificial intelligence? And yet we think some new jobs will be created, but they won't be the same people. So how do we deal with that pending crisis that's coming up? And this is why it's important to understand who your top performers are. How do you protect them, develop them, and also clone them? What is it that makes them such good developers, such great top performers? And then develop the people who you think could be potentially those top performers internally or hiring them from outside and making sure that you are understanding who responds best to coaching and learning and training and development. Because in a perma crisis, the skills and the roles that you have for people are going to be constantly changing. And so you need people who are on that growth curve, who your top performers are the ones who are going to learn and develop and change and adapt as the situation adapts to as well. So finding those people who respond really well to coaching, to direction, to feedback is going to be a crucial part of leading your team. All right, a couple of things here. Let's see. Sadnam has a question. Could you please tell me your opinion about the times when there is a high economic pressure and we cannot be responsive to manpower? I think what you're meaning here is that if you have this high economic pressure and you can't address it by being able to lay off people. I think first of all, laying off people, if it should be an absolute last resort because we talk about people being your most important asset. So there are some things here that we can do. Again, some people have taken across the board cuts. There may be like a 10% reduction in salaries for a certain time period as we get through things. There's ways that you could potentially squeeze more out of your customers. There are only so many levers you can push. But at some point, you have to make some really tough decisions around what are the things you're going to cut. Again, there are only so many things you can cut, but really taking a zero-based budget approach to things helps a lot. But also challenging some of the most important assumptions we have. Well, we can't touch that. Well, why can't we touch that? What's the underlying assumption behind it? And the way we dealt with crises in the past are not necessarily the ways that we have to deal with them again in a perma crisis, where this is going to become an issue over and over and over again. All right, so let's see. Abdul has a question. What's the major thing to lead out of a complex situation? I'm going to talk about that in just a second, about how do you figure out and take apart the complexity. So hold on, Abdul. We're going to get to that in just a second. And then, Jay, you have a great point here. Organizational agility and coordination are key qualities that are supported and engendered by trust and agency. And that's a great way to lead into my third point about leading the organization. And this is really one of the things that Abdul was talking about. When you're in a perma crisis, there's so much complexity. There are so many things coming at you. How do you start teasing apart what's the most important thing? What do we have to make decisions on? And what are things that we can just leave alone and not have to deal with? And this is why decision fatigue is such an issue, because there are just too many decisions. We have to start from scratch on each one of them. They're completely unrelated or they're absolutely related, and I don't know where to start. And I'll give you an example. I in my last book, The Disruption Mindset, I had this great case study from Nokia. And back in about 2013, again, this has been 10 years now, they were shifting from being a handset manufacturer, remember those Nokia phones, to being an internet communications and technology company. So they could see the writing on the wall. They were no longer going to be players in the handset space. And instead, they wanted to go into the deep technology and communications infrastructure space, which they had some investments in with Nokia Siemens. And in order to make this happen, they had to do three major moves and acquisitions and divestments. So they met as a board over 200 times over 2 years. In 2013 alone, I have my notes here, they had 64 board meetings and committee meetings. And I was asking the chairman, Risto Silisma, so what was that like? Was it really stressful? Were you constantly like in a state of constant stress? And he said, just the opposite. It was really calm. And talk about being in a perma crisis, right? You know that over the next 2 years, some major things all just had to be aligned just right for the survival of the company. And he said the reason why is we knew what we wanted to accomplish. We had all these backup plans. We had done scenarios so that if this happens, there was a playbook they could just literally pull out of the drawer and know what this was. So each of the meetings was an update to say, this is what happened. And according to our plans, this is what we're going to take, the action we're going to take. Is everyone agreed? Is there anything that we need to change? And so the reason why these decisions were so not easy, but smooth for them is that they had done all the work in advance. They'd anticipated all the different things that could happen. And believe me, there were some crazy things that were happening. They were trying to sell the handsets to Microsoft. They said yes, and then they said no, and then the board said yes, and the CEO said no, and it just went back and forth. And they just went through the whole thing like, okay, yeah, so this is what we do next. So this is what I call knowing what your big plays are going to be. So Abdul, this is really breaking it down and really understanding what are the most important decisions, the most important things that have to go right for your strategy to succeed. Knowing your big plays really clarifies everything because you know what you're going to look for, you know what you're going to be making decisions around, you know the key factors that will make your big plays a success or a failure. So you really focus on those decisions and those factors. You look at the assumptions that you're making, you write out the scenarios, and you say, are these assumptions coming true or not? And we adjust the actions and the plans based on that. So, a couple things to do with this to make this all happen. The number one thing is to stay as close as you can to your customers, and not only your customers of today, but also understanding who your customers are going to be in the future. Understanding, again, this is a key part for being transformational and disruptive, is you have to have a view of what the future looks like. And we don't do this as leaders because, well, what if we're wrong? What if we're wrong about predicting the future? But if you know what that future has, you have an idea and you know step by step what are the things that have to be true, then you get more and more clear that that future is going to happen or it's not. And you shift directions and you move in a different way. But having that point in the future gives you solidity, it gives you structure, gives you focus and alignment for yourself, your team, your board, your customers, everybody in your ecosystem, and you know what your plays are going to be. So I've talked about this in the past that strategic planning then becomes an agile aspect of how you do work. Oftentimes, strategy is done on a yearly basis, and you're not really putting together a strategy, you're putting together a budget for the next 12 months. And as you get closer and closer to the end of those 12 months, you have less and less runway and fewer and more constraints to have to meet that budget. A much healthier way is to do what I call a 6-quarter walk, where you're planning out 18 months in advance. And at the end of each quarter, you know what you're trying to accomplish in order to get to your big play at the end of the 18 months. Because if you don't know what you're aiming for, then how do you figure out what you're going to do today? And these are detailed plans every single quarter. And as the quarter proceeds, you're having a pretty good idea. Are we going to be there? Are we going to get to that point at the end of the quarter? And you're adjusting your plans so that at the end of the quarter, you're checking in with everyone. Is everybody here at the same place? If we're not, some of us are ahead or some are behind, then we adjust the plan going forward and extend it another quarter. So it's another 18 months and all your plans shift. It seems like a lot of work, but actually it isn't because what you're updating are your assumptions and adjusting the plan as you go along. And this becomes extremely important when you're in a highly volatile area or if you're in a high growth company. Both of those require a lot of rethinking, a lot of transformation and change and managing all of that. And unless you have a detailed plan for everybody in the organization going out 18 months, what are you working on? You're just working on what's in front of you at this particular moment. And that's not going to be helpful because it's going to be swayed by whichever crisis is landing on your desk. So knowing where your big plays are, knowing what direction of travel you're trying to go to with your organization becomes a key part of leading in the permacrisis. So that's what I have for today. I just want to reiterate again, this is about leading yourself, being in a good place, being able to stay in a point of mindfulness and wisdom so that you can make your decisions and deal with the emotions of yourself. So lead yourself first, make sure you have the support, leading your teams, making sure that the relationship is really strong between you and them, that they understand and can trust that this relationship is going to be the first and most important thing in the organization. And the third, leading your organization, knowing where your big plays are going to be. Where are you headed towards? In that these crises may come on and you may have to adjust that, but how is it adjusting it? And instead of being thrown completely off track by big, huge crises like a pandemic or economic recession or a war, you can really focus on dealing with the situation, knowing what your long-term plans are going to be. So that's what I have for today. Let's see. I'm going to be taking next week off because it's a holiday here in the United States for July 4th. So I will be back on July 11th. I don't know what I'm going to be talking yet about yet. I'm still working on the content plan, probably something around artificial intelligence. Just a quick update on that because I haven't been talking about that over the past few weeks. But I'm also very open to suggestions on what you would like to hear about. So always, as at any time, please reach out to me. You have my email, charlene@charlenelee.com. You have social media. You can comment on this live stream, read every single comment. Please share with me what's on your mind. What would you like me to talk about? And I will be back here on the live stream in exactly 2 weeks. Until then, stay transformative, stay agile, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks.